The morning air hung heavy with the remnants of the night before, thick humidity clinging to the trees, the quiet stillness broken only by the occasional passing car. It was supposed to be an uneventful drive, just another routine morning for the man behind the wheel of a commercial truck. He had taken this route countless times before, cutting through the quiet rural stretches of Fort Ripley, Minnesota. But that morning something was different. As his headlights swept across the curve of the road, they illuminated a shape lying motionless in the gravel shoulder. At first he thought it was debris, maybe a discarded bag or an unfortunate deer. But as his truck rolled closer, the form became unmistakable. A human body. He slammed on the brakes. The engine hummed softly as he sat frozen in place, his breath catching in his throat. Something was terribly wrong. The figure was a woman, her limbs unnaturally splayed out, her face turned upward toward the sky. Her skin was pale, drained of warmth, her eyes open but vacant. She wore a simple tank top and shorts, her feet bare. There were no visible signs of a brutal struggle, no pools of blood, no shattered glass, no skid marks on the asphalt. A hit and run? Maybe, but something didn't sit right. Reaching for his phone, the man dialed 911, his hands shaking slightly as he relayed what he had found. There's a body on the side of the road. A woman. I think she's dead. The dispatcher's voice remained calm, professional. Can you confirm if she's breathing? He hesitated. No, I don't think so. She's not moving. I don't want to touch her. The dispatcher assured him officers were en route. Less than 10 minutes later, flashing red and blue lights reflected off the damp pavement. A sheriff's deputy stepped out first, scanning the scene before crouching beside the lifeless woman. He checked for a pulse. Nothing. With a deep exhale, he stood and radioed in. We've got a deceased female. No immediate signs of trauma. This might be a fatal accident. Or something else. Another officer began securing the perimeter, pushing back the small crowd of onlookers that had begun to gather near the roadside. It wasn't long before more officers and crime scene investigators arrived, their flashlights cutting through the early morning gloom. Who was she? How had she ended up here? As the sun began to rise, casting long shadows over the desolate stretch of highway, the first real questions began to form. This was not just a tragic accident. Something had happened to her, and someone knew why. The heat of the rising sun did little to dispel the unease that had settled over the crime scene. Officers worked methodically, marking evidence, snapping photographs, murmuring observations to one another. The woman's body remained untouched, lying just off the gravel shoulder, as if she had been placed there with careless indifference. There was something unsettling about the scene, something that didn't quite fit the typical patterns of an accident. The absence of skid marks on the pavement, the lack of any obvious injuries that would suggest she had been struck at high speed, none of it aligned with the idea of a routine hit and run. Her clothing, a simple tank top and shorts, hinted at the heat of the previous evening. But her bare feet suggested something else entirely. A person rarely ventured out without shoes unless they had been in a hurry, or unless they hadn't planned on walking anywhere at all. There was no purse, no phone, no wallet. The pockets of her shorts were empty, devoid of anything that might hint at her identity. The only thing left behind was her body, abandoned like an afterthought. By the time the forensic team began their initial assessment, the first whispers of a possible identification had begun circulating. Dispatch had started cross-referencing missing persons reports, checking with local hospitals, looking for anyone who had been reported missing overnight. It didn't take long for a name to surface. A woman matching the description had been reported missing just a few hours earlier. A close friend had made the call, worried after not hearing from her since the night before. The woman's name was Angela McClelland. A detective, flipping through the information, noted the details aloud. 49 years old, no known history of mental illness, no prior reports of domestic disturbances, but a single note stood out. She had recently confided in a friend that she was thinking about leaving her husband. She had been hesitant, reluctant to share details over the phone, promising to explain everything later. Later never came. Investigators began piecing together her last known movements. She had attended a gathering the night before, a casual social event among friends. Multiple people confirmed that she had arrived with her husband, Tony McClelland. They had mingled, had a few drinks. Some recalled seeing them laughing together. Others, however, remembered something different. Angela had seemed withdrawn, unusually quiet. At one point, she had been seen talking in hushed tones with a close friend, away from her husband's earshot. Then there was the argument. Not a full-blown fight, not loud enough to cause a scene, but noticeable, a shift in energy, a tension that made those around them uncomfortable. Witnesses recalled seeing Tony lean in close, whispering something to her, his expression unreadable. Shortly after, they left together. That was the last time anyone had seen Angela alive. The timeline was crucial. If she had left the gathering with Tony and hours later, her body was found dumped on the side of the road, then what had happened in between? Investigators started pulling surveillance footage from gas stations, traffic cameras, and nearby businesses, looking for anything that might provide clarity. It didn't take long to find something. A grainy video from a roadside camera captured a dark-colored pickup truck traveling along the same stretch of highway in the early morning hours, just minutes before the estimated time of Angela's death. The vehicle slowed briefly before speeding up again. There was no sign of a collision, no evidence that a driver had lost control. But something about the movement was off, almost as if the truck had paused, hesitated, before pulling away. The forensic team, meanwhile, was uncovering more unsettling details. There were traces of dirt and gravel on Angela's skin, but they weren't consistent with being struck by a vehicle. The impact wounds weren't severe enough to indicate she had been thrown by force. Instead, her injuries suggested something different, like she had been placed there after the fact. The first real lead came from a neighbor who lived near Angela and Tony. When officers knocked on the door, the man hesitated before speaking, glancing between the officers and the police cars parked along the curb. Finally, he sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He had heard yelling the night before, loud enough that he had considered calling the police, but the argument had eventually died down. Then later, he wasn't sure of the time, he had heard the sound of a truck pulling away, fast, like someone leaving in a hurry. It was enough for officers to turn their attention to the McClelland residence. A modest home, nothing out of place at first glance, but there was no answer at the door. No sign of movement inside. The driveway was empty. Tony McClelland was nowhere to be found. The investigation intensified as the sun rose higher in the sky, casting a sharp glare over the quiet roads of Fort Ripley. The small town rarely saw major crimes, let alone an unattended body discovered on the outskirts of town with no immediate explanation. It was the kind of case that unsettled even the most seasoned detectives, not because of its brutality, but because of its eerie lack of context. There was no weapon, no clear signs of violence, no obvious accident scene. Just a woman, discarded like an afterthought, and a series of unanswered questions lingering in the humid summer air. Angela McClelland's identity had been confirmed within hours, but the circumstances leading to her death remained murky. Investigators had begun tracing her final known movements, piecing together fragments of the night before. Each detail brought a new layer to the growing mystery. Angela and her husband, Tony McClelland, had been at a gathering with friends, a casual get-together where drinks were poured freely, and conversations drifted between lighthearted banter and deeper discussions. Witnesses described Angela as quieter than usual, distant in a way that didn't go unnoticed. At some point, she had pulled a close friend aside, speaking in hushed tones. She had looked over her shoulder more than once, as if making sure someone wasn't listening. And then, there was the argument. It hadn't escalated to shouting, but those nearby had noticed the shift in energy. Tony had leaned in, his voice low but firm. Angela had responded, her posture stiffening, her expression unreadable. The tension was unmistakable. And then, minutes later, they had left together. That was the last time anyone had seen her alive. Investigators reviewed security footage from gas stations and traffic cameras along the likely route they had taken home. At first, there was nothing, just the usual blur of late-night traffic, headlights cutting through the darkness. But then, a grainy video showed Tony's truck. It moved steadily along the highway until just for a moment, it slowed. There was no intersection, no reason for hesitation. And then, without warning, it accelerated again. disappearing into the night. That pause, that hesitation. It was brief but deliberate. At the same time, forensic analysis of Angela's body was beginning to paint a clearer picture. There were signs of impact, but not consistent with a high-speed collision. There was no road rash, no broken limbs that would typically indicate she had been thrown by a vehicle. Instead, her injuries suggested something more controlled, like a sudden, forceful impact followed by a fall. Her feet were another detail that didn't add up. She had been found barefoot on the side of the road, but there was no dirt embedded deep in her skin, no signs that she had walked a long distance on gravel or pavement. If she had exited the vehicle on her own, her feet should have told a different story. But they didn't. Angela had not walked onto that road. She had been placed there. Detectives returned to the McClelland residence, expecting answers. Instead, they were met with an unsettling silence. The house was dark, the driveway empty. Neighbors had noticed the police presence and began gathering at a distance, murmuring among themselves. One of them, an older man, finally approached. He spoke cautiously, as if weighing his words. He had heard an argument the night before, loud enough that it had made him pause. It wasn't the first time. The McClellands had their share of fights, but something about this one had felt different, more desperate, more final. And then much later, he had heard a truck pull away, fast. Investigators exchanged glances. The details were aligning in a way that was impossible to ignore. The footage, the argument, the truck speeding off in the night, it all pointed in one direction. Now they needed to find Tony McClelland, and they needed to find him fast. The investigation had reached a turning point. Angela McClelland's body had been found under circumstances that defied easy explanation, and her final hours were beginning to take shape through surveillance footage, forensic analysis, and eyewitness accounts. But one crucial element remained missing: Tony McClelland. By the time law enforcement returned to the McClelland residence, there was still no sign of him. His truck, which was seen on the grainy highway footage, was absent. The home itself was undisturbed, locked, curtains drawn. There were no immediate signs of a struggle inside. Nothing suggested that someone had hastily packed and fled, but the silence inside the house felt calculated. Investigators canvassed the neighborhood again, speaking with anyone who might have seen or heard from him in the last few hours. Most had nothing new to offer, but one neighbor mentioned something that stood out. A brief encounter that had seemed unremarkable at the time, but now carried new weight. Early in the morning, not long after Angela's body had been found, the neighbor had seen Tony's truck pulling out of the driveway. It wasn't unusual for him to leave early, but what struck the witness was the way the truck hesitated at the end of the street. It idled for longer than expected, as if the driver was contemplating something, debating whether to turn left or right. And then, as suddenly as it had stopped, the truck had sped off, disappearing beyond the tree-lined road. It wasn't enough to determine where he had gone, but it was confirmation that he was on the move. Detectives expanded their search, checking locations Tony was known to frequent. His workplace was the first stop. He had been a mechanic for years, working in a modest repair shop just outside of town. The shop owner had been expecting him that morning, but Tony had never arrived. No phone calls, no messages, nothing. His co-workers exchanged uneasy glances, their voices hushed as they admitted that something about Tony had felt off lately. One man, who had known Tony for years, mentioned that he had been drinking more than usual, showing up to work hungover or distracted. The tension in his marriage was no secret. People had noticed Angela's absences at social events, the way she seemed to be retreating further into herself. No one had thought much of it at the time. Marital struggles were private matters, and most assumed they would work it out. But now, in the context of what had happened, those observations felt like missed warning signs. The next stop was a local bar Tony was known to frequent. The bartender recognized his name immediately, confirming that he had been there just days before. He had been drinking heavily, alone at first, before striking up conversation with another regular. The conversation had started normal enough, complaints about work, about life. But then, as the night wore on and the drinks kept coming, his words turned darker. He had talked about regrets, about how life had a way of boxing a man in, trapping him in places he never wanted to be, about how sometimes people just needed to disappear. At the time, the bartender had dismissed it as drunken rambling. Now it felt like something else entirely. Law enforcement widened their search, running checks on motels, gas stations, any location where Tony might have stopped to refuel or lay low. They issued a bolo, be on the lookout, for his truck, urging officers in neighboring counties to keep an eye out. The pressure was mounting. And then, finally, a break. A traffic camera miles away from Fort Ripley picked up a vehicle matching Tony's truck. It was moving fast, heading toward a remote area known for its fishing cabins and hunting lodges. Investigators had their lead. With urgency, officers mobilized, heading in the direction the truck had been seen. If Tony McClelland was trying to escape, he had made a mistake. He had left a trail. The search for Tony McClelland had shifted from a local investigation to a multi-county pursuit. His disappearance, coupled with the suspicious circumstances of Angela's death, had transformed him from a person of interest to a fugitive. Law enforcement had seen it before. A man on the run, avoiding the inevitable, hoping to buy himself time. But time wasn't on Tony's side. Every movement left a trace. Every decision narrowed the possibilities. And now investigators had a lead. The traffic camera footage had placed Tony's truck heading toward a remote stretch of land known for its isolated cabins, dense forests, and winding backroads. It was the kind of place people went to escape. Hunters rented cabins there in the fall, fishermen in the summer. Some owned land passed down through generations, preferring the solitude of a life removed from town. If Tony was heading in that direction, it meant one of two things. Either he had a place to hide, or he was looking for somewhere to disappear permanently. Sheriff's deputies and state patrol officers coordinated their next move, spreading out across the roads leading into the area. They checked gas stations along the route, asking attendants if they had seen a man matching Tony's description. Most had nothing to report. Then, at a small, run-down convenience store off the highway, a clerk remembered something. A man had come in earlier that morning, looking nervous, moving quickly through the aisles. He had purchased a few basic items: bottled water, canned food, a pack of cigarettes. He paid in cash, barely spoke a word. When asked if he had been driving a truck, the clerk hesitated before nodding. That was enough. He was out there. Investigators moved quickly. They identified possible locations Tony could be heading toward: old hunting cabins, campsites, remote fishing docks. They checked vehicle records, searching for any property connected to his name or to friends or family who might offer him shelter. A few locations stood out, places Tony had been known to visit over the years. Some were abandoned, nothing more than empty shells of buildings, forgotten by time. Others were still used occasionally, remote enough that a person could stay hidden for days without drawing attention. A team was sent to the most likely site, a secluded cabin deep in the woods, down an unmarked dirt road barely wide enough for a truck. It had once belonged to an old friend of Tony's, though no one had seen that friend in years. The structure was still standing, weathered and sagging under the weight of neglect. As the officers approached, they noticed something: the faint indentations of tire tracks in the mud. They were fresh. The team moved cautiously, their presence silent except for the crunch of gravel underfoot. The cabin's door was slightly ajar, a dark void leading into an unknown space. An officer signaled to another, then stepped forward, pushing the door open with deliberate force. Inside, the cabin was sparse, abandoned furniture coated in dust, the air stale and heavy. But someone had been there recently. On the old wooden table sat an open can of food, a half-empty bottle of water. A cigarette smoldered in an ashtray, its tip still glowing faintly. Tony had been there, maybe minutes ago. A sudden noise outside, a rustling, the snap of a twig. The officers turned, scanning the tree line, but the dense forest revealed nothing. Then the sound of footsteps, rapid, fleeing. He was running. The chase was on. The pursuit began before the officers had time to call it in. The sound of branches snapping, the uneven rhythm of hurried footsteps on damp earth. Tony McClelland was running. He had seen them coming, heard the shift in the air, the unmistakable weight of law enforcement moving toward him. And in that moment, he had made his choice. He wasn't going to wait. He wasn't going to talk. He was going to disappear. The forest was thick, a dense tangle of trees and undergrowth, the kind of terrain that swallowed people whole if they didn't know how to navigate it. Tony did. He had spent time here before, hunting in the colder months, fishing when the weather was warmer. He knew which paths led nowhere, which trails looped back on themselves, which routes might give him enough of a lead to slip away. The officers, trained and experienced, moved quickly but methodically, tracking the disturbance in the foliage, the fresh impressions in the damp soil. They fanned out, moving in pairs, their radios crackling as they coordinated their positions. They weren't going to let him vanish. Tony was fast, but he wasn't quiet. His breath came in ragged pulls, his boots scuffing against exposed roots and loose rocks. Every misstep sent birds into flight, their wings a sharp, beating warning in the silence. He was pushing forward on instinct, not strategy, his body driven by adrenaline rather than reason. The officers were gaining. Up ahead, the land sloped downward, a steep decline leading to a narrow creek. It was the kind of place that looked passable until it wasn't. Tony reached the edge, hesitating only for a fraction of a second before scrambling down, sliding more than running, catching himself on the branches that clawed at his arms. The water below was shallow, cutting a jagged path through the terrain, its surface broken by rocks and fallen logs. He had no choice. He waded in, the cold shocking against his skin. The current wasn't strong, but it was enough to make each step uncertain. His breath came faster now, his chest heaving. He needed a plan. He needed time. The officers reached the crest of the hill moments later. They spotted him immediately, moving through the water, trying to put distance between himself and the inevitable. A warning call went out, voices commanding him to stop. He didn't. They moved fast, cutting through the trees to intercept him downstream. He wasn't going to get far. Tony reached the opposite bank, his legs heavy, his boots soaked through. The ground was slick, the incline working against him. He clawed at the dirt, pulling himself upward, each movement more desperate than the last. Then another misstep. His foot slid, his weight shifting abruptly, and for a moment he lost control. His body pitched backward, arms flailing, the sky above him tilting. He hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs. By the time he tried to move again, the officers were on him. They didn't need to say anything. The weight of their presence alone told him it was over. Tony McClelland was in custody, and now the real questions could begin. Tony McClelland sat in the cold, windowless interrogation room, his soaked clothes clinging to his skin. His hands, still raw from his desperate attempt to flee, rested motionless on the table in front of him. The fluorescent light overhead hummed softly, casting an unflattering glow on his exhausted face. He didn't look at the mirrored glass on the far wall, didn't try to guess who might be watching from the other side. He only stared at the table, his jaw set tight, his expression unreadable. The arrest had been quick, decisive. Officers had pulled him from the damp earth of the creek bed, securing his wrist before he had time to resist. He had been too out of breath to protest, too drained to fight back. By the time they loaded him into the squad car, the adrenaline had started to wear off, leaving only exhaustion in its wake. The ride back to the station had been silent. He hadn't asked where they were taking him. He hadn't said a word. Now, in the small, sterile room, the weight of the situation pressed in. He was no longer a man running from something vague and distant. He was here, trapped, with nowhere left to go. On the other side of the glass, detectives observed him in silence. His body language spoke louder than words, shoulders hunched slightly forward, fingers twitching as he flexed his wrists against the cuffs. He looked like a man who had been cornered, but not necessarily broken. The lead investigator entered the room, his footsteps deliberate, the chair scraping against the floor as he sat across from Tony. There was no rush, no immediate pressure. The silence between them stretched long, controlled. Tony didn't react. The detective placed a folder on the table, flipping it open slowly. Inside were crime scene photographs, printed reports, statements from witnesses. The first image was one that had already been burned into the minds of everyone involved in the case. Angela McClelland, lying motionless on the side of the road, her eyes fixed on a sky that no longer held any meaning for her. Still, Tony didn't look. The detective spoke, his voice level, methodical. He laid out the facts, not accusations, just cold, objective details. Angela had been found early that morning. She had been left in a place where no one would have immediately seen her. Her body showed no signs of a high-speed impact, no evidence that she had been thrown by a passing car. She had been moved, placed. The injuries suggested something more controlled, blunt force trauma, but not the kind that came from a reckless accident. Then there was the footage. The grainy security video from the highway, the dark-colored truck slowing down, hesitating for just a moment before pulling away. A vehicle that matched the description of Tony's, and finally the forensic evidence. The traces of blood found on his truck. The data from his vehicle's onboard system showing it had come to a stop at the exact location where Angela's body had been discovered. The inconsistencies in his alibi. Tony exhaled through his nose, slow and measured, but still he didn't speak. The detective leaned back, arms crossed, watching him carefully. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was strategic. Then finally Tony shifted. His fingers tapped once against the metal table. A habit, a nervous tick. His gaze lifted from the surface, meeting the detectives for the first time. He looked tired. The kind of tired that had nothing to do with running through the woods. The kind of tired that came from knowing something had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. The room remained still, the low hum of fluorescent lights filling the silence like white noise against the weight of the interrogation. The detective didn't press. He didn't need to. Silence was its own form of pressure, an invisible force that gnawed at the edges of a guilty mind. And Tony McClelland was unraveling, even if he didn't realize it yet. His fingers had stopped tapping against the table, but his breathing had changed. Shallower, controlled, but not effortless. His body was betraying him in ways that words didn't need to. The detective remained calm, methodical, as he laid out more of the evidence. He detailed the inconsistencies in Tony's initial account, the way his story didn't align with the forensic findings. He pointed out the impossibility of Angela simply wandering onto the road and collapsing in just the right way to suggest she had been moved. The lack of debris, the absence of drag marks, things that couldn't be explained away as coincidence. Then there was the vehicle data, the undeniable proof that his truck had stopped at the location where Angela's body was found. The slow hesitation, the acceleration, the deliberate nature of it all. Tony's jaw tightened. His eyes flickered, barely, but enough for the detective to notice. He wasn't just listening now, he was absorbing, processing, weighing his options. Outside the interrogation room, other officers were working around the clock. Detectives reviewed additional security footage, searching for anything that might further confirm the timeline. Angela's phone records were being combed through, text messages analyzed, call logs cross-referenced. Her last interactions were under scrutiny, not just for what was said, but for what wasn't. Meanwhile, forensic technicians had continued examining Tony's truck. They weren't just looking for blood. They were looking for microscopic evidence, fibers, skin cells, anything that would tell the story of what had happened in the final moments before Angela's body was abandoned. And they had found something. Small traces of hair, strands embedded in the vehicle's rear bumper, not visible to the naked eye, but unmistakable under forensic analysis. The kind of evidence that didn't just suggest impact, it confirmed contact. The pieces were coming together, forming a picture that was becoming harder to deny. Inside the room, Tony remained rigid, his posture stiff, his hands now clasped together on the table. The detective watched him closely, waiting for the moment when the weight of it all would finally break through. Guilt was a slow, creeping thing. It didn't always come with dramatic confessions or outbursts. Sometimes it settled in like a heavy fog, suffocating in its quiet inevitability. Tony swallowed, the movement barely perceptible. His breathing had slowed. The walls were closing in, and he knew it. The walls of the interrogation room remained unyielding, the air heavy with the unspoken truth lingering between Tony McClelland and the detective sitting across from him. Hours had passed since he had been brought in. The slow erosion of his silence was evident not in his words but in the way his posture had shifted. His shoulders no longer squared with defiance, his eyes darting toward the case file lying open on the table, but never quite focusing on it. He was breaking. The detective knew it, and more importantly, so did Tony. Outside the room, the investigation continued at an unrelenting pace. Officers scoured surveillance footage, not just from the night of Angela's death, but from the days leading up to it. A pattern had begun to emerge, a slow unraveling of a marriage that had been strained long before that fatal night. Angela had been preparing to leave. She had spoken to friends, confiding in them about her growing unease, about the way Tony's temper had worsened, about how she no longer felt safe. She had started putting money aside, small amounts withdrawn over weeks. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would immediately set off alarms. But it was enough to suggest a plan. And then there was the message. A text sent to a friend the night she died. It was short, almost cryptic, but it carried the weight of someone who knew they might not have another chance to speak. If anything happens, remember what I told you. The friend had never responded, hadn't even seen the message until the following morning. By then, it was already too late. In the forensic lab, specialists worked meticulously to uncover every possible clue hidden within Tony's truck. The blood traces on the bumper had already been matched to Angela, but that wasn't the only thing they had found. Dirt samples taken from the tires suggested the vehicle had been driven off the main road, onto an unpaved wooded path before returning to the highway. The type of soil wasn't consistent with the roadside where Angela's body had been found. It raised another question. Had she been left somewhere else first? Had Tony stopped before abandoning her on the highway, hesitating, reconsidering? Inside the interrogation room, the detective didn't push, didn't rush. He let the silence do the work, let the weight of everything building outside that room press down on Tony's shoulders. The longer he sat there, the heavier it became. Tony exhaled, long and slow, running his hands over his face. He looked up at the ceiling for a moment, then back down, his fingers tightening into a fist before relaxing again. Guilt wasn't always immediate. Sometimes it crept in slowly, wrapping around a person's throat until they couldn't breathe under the weight of it. The detective didn't need him to speak yet, because the truth was already speaking for him. The air inside the interrogation room had become suffocating, thick with an unspoken truth that refused to stay buried. Hours had passed. The detective remained steady, his presence a quiet force that refused to let Tony McClelland escape the weight of his own conscience. The room was devoid of time, no clocks, no windows, nothing to anchor Tony to anything but the inevitable. The forensic evidence was undeniable. The blood on his truck, the hair fibers, the GPS data proving he had stopped exactly where Angela's body had been found. Every logical avenue of escape had closed, leaving him with only two choices: continue denying everything or finally speak the truth. Outside, the world moved forward. Investigators had continued piecing together the puzzle of Angela's final moments. A new revelation had surfaced. A witness, a truck driver who had been passing through the area that night, had come forward after hearing the news. He hadn't seen everything, but he had seen enough. A dark-colored truck pulled over on the side of the road, a figure standing near the open passenger door, a woman's body motionless on the ground. The driver hadn't known what he was looking at in the moment, but now there was no mistaking it. Angela had still been alive when she was left on that roadside. The detective placed a new photo in front of Tony, one taken from the forensic team's findings. The angle of the body, the lack of dirt on her feet, the absence of road rash. It was all there, in black and white. She hadn't been hit by a car. She had been placed there, abandoned. Tony swallowed hard. The detective didn't need him to say anything. The evidence had already spoken for him. But then Tony did something he hadn't done in hours. He exhaled, a long, shuddering breath, his shoulders deflating as if the weight of the past 24 hours had finally settled on him. His fingers, which had remained locked together, twitched once, then loosened. He blinked, his gaze shifting to the image in front of him, and for the first time, he truly looked at it. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. "I didn't mean for it to happen." The words were hollow, stripped of conviction. They weren't an admission of guilt, not yet. But they were the first crack in the dam. The detective didn't respond immediately. He let the silence linger, giving Tony room to continue. Tony clenched his jaw, his hands forming fists against the table. He didn't lift his head. didn't meet the detective's gaze. "She was leaving me," he muttered, the words filled with something raw, something desperate. "She said she was done." The next few moments unraveled in stops and starts. He talked about the fight, the anger, the way she had threatened to walk away for good. He had been drinking. Too much, too fast. He didn't remember who threw the first insult, only that it had escalated. She had gotten out of the truck, started walking. He had followed, yelling, trying to get her back inside. Then the moment he could barely bring himself to say out loud, "I backed up," he murmured. "I didn't see her. I didn't think she was—" His voice cracked, the rest of the sentence dying in his throat. The detective remained expressionless, but inside he knew this was it. Tony had stopped talking, but it was enough. The evidence had already confirmed what had happened, but now they had what they needed, his own words. Angela hadn't died instantly. She had been hurt, badly, but still breathing. Tony had panicked. He had looked down at the woman he had spent years of his life with and had made a decision. Instead of calling for help, instead of trying to save her, he had left her there, bleeding, alone. He had gotten back into his truck, driven away, and never looked back. And now the law would not look away from him. The case moved swiftly through the system. The evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution had a clear narrative, backed by forensic analysis, eyewitness accounts, and, most damning of all, Tony's own admission. The courtroom was packed on the first day of trial. The media had latched onto the case, turning Angela McClelland into a tragic symbol. A woman who had tried to escape an unhappy marriage, only to have her life taken in an instant. The prosecution painted Tony as a man whose pride couldn't handle rejection, whose actions, whether intentional or reckless, had cost an innocent woman her life. The defense tried to argue that it had been a tragic accident, that Tony had been intoxicated, impaired, not thinking clearly. They pushed for lesser charges, citing lack of intent. But the jury didn't see it that way. The facts were unshakable. He had hit her. He had left her to die. That was not just an accident. That was negligence at the very least. Angela's friends and family sat in the courtroom, silent but firm, their presence a reminder of what had been lost. Some wept quietly. Others sat stoic, watching as the man who had once been part of Angela's life was now— The town of Fort Ripley would remember Angela, but memory was a fragile thing. As weeks passed, headlines shifted. The case faded from public attention, replaced by new stories, new tragedies. The world moved forward, indifferent to the grief it left behind. But for those closest to Angela, time did not soften the reality of her absence. Her closest friends kept her memory alive in small ways. Some visited her favorite spots, a quiet bench near the lake, a local cafe where she used to linger over coffee. Others channeled their grief into action, advocating for stronger laws around domestic violence and vehicular manslaughter. Angela had wanted to leave, to start over. In a way, they wanted to honor that, by helping others recognize the warning signs before it was too late. As for Tony, his time in prison began without fanfare. He was not a high-profile criminal, not a name that would be remembered beyond the walls of the correctional facility where he served his sentence. His days were long, monotonous, spent in the quiet realization that he had destroyed not only Angela's life, but his own. 4 years would pass. Eventually, he would walk free. But freedom did not mean redemption. There were some crimes that time could not erase. And for Angela, there was no walking away. She had been ready to start a new chapter. Instead, her story had ended on the side of a dark highway, abandoned in the final moments of her life. She would never get the chance to move forward, but those who loved her would make sure she was never forgotten. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.